Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, kushalmehra. My guest today is Ganesh Swaminathan, and we're going to be discussing his book, From the Beginning of Time. Ganesh, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Kushal. Really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time. Yeah.
All right, Ganesh, before we start with the discussion of the book, I always have this rule. So whenever I have a book author on, my first question I ask to them is, why did you decide to write this book? And not only that, Ganesh, I would request you to tell everyone a bit about yourself too. So go for it.
Okay. So first off, thanks again for hosting me, Kushal, and thanks to your viewers for tuning in. Today is the Tamil New Year Day, and I assume it is the New Year Day for a lot of people. So my best wishes to everybody for a wonderful year. We've had a pretty tough year the last time around, and I'm hoping this one's better. So let's get back to your question. Why did I decide to write the book? I never imagined I would write a book in my life, ever. Right? I was an engineer. I enjoyed being an engineer. I went on to do my MBA. I was a mechanical engineer from IIT Delhi, and then I went on to do my MBA from IIM Ahmedabad, and I was in business. And I've been in business selling technology for more than 2 decades now. And so writing a book was very far away, but I was a voracious reader as a child. I used to read a lot. I used to read books, magazines, just everything that came my way when I was little. And that followed me. And I was also interested in science, right? I was interested in science. I was a science student. And I was interested in space science. So while I don't have any formal training in space science, like an astronomy degree or something, I used to read a lot and kept myself abreast through interviews, through podcasts and books and articles and so on, and so YouTube videos and so on. And just by a strange twist of events, about 8 years ago, a little over 8 years ago, I started reading the Puranas, right? Puranas is something that very few people bother to read, right? Just to put it out there. And among the engineering community, probably even fewer. But I don't want, that's a whole story on its own. But I started reading the Puranas, and I didn't know what to expect, honestly. I mean, none of us knows what to expect because none of us has read a Purana. We just know about it as stories of gods and goddesses and kings and sages and so on and so forth. So I said, okay, maybe I want to do something different. I want to read something different, so I'll read one. So I started with the Matsya Purana. And the text that I read was incredibly sophisticated, right? So you expect a 2,000-year-old text, right? You expect what can it have? It should be very simplistic. It should be very simplistic in its plot and its details. And when I read the Matsya Purana, I was completely engrossed, right? First thing is that it was a very sophisticated text. Like, let me give you an example. Within the first 100 pages, there is now I'm reading a translation. My Sanskrit is no good, right? But they talk about things like the political economy had not taken root. And the phrase political economy is something that had come into currency about 300 years ago. So what is it doing? What is this concept doing in a 2,000-year-old text? And so on and so many other things like this. And then obviously there were references to the moon and stars, which I thought was very fascinating just because of my interest in the topic. And I just read through the entire Matsya Purana like I was reading a book, right? And I didn't have enough of it, so I finished it, and then I ordered the Shiva Purana. And then I read the Shiva Purana completely end to end. Then I wasn't satisfied, so I read the Bhagavata Purana. And then I realized I couldn't get any more prints because, nobody reads this, so nobody prints them, nobody publishes them anymore. So finally, I managed to get something that I could download on the internet. I got the Brahmanda Purana, and I printed it myself, right? So I went to a print shop, and I printed the whole PDF, and I read it, and then I read the Kalika Purana and the Devi Purana. And by the time you read your third or your fourth Purana, the first couple of Puranas, everything is new, right? So you're kind of just getting your head around it. But by the third or the fourth Puran, what happens is that a lot of the stories are repeated. Right? For example, the story of Moon and Rohini. Right? It's a very commonly known story. It's repeated. You read it the second time and the third time, and you notice in the Puran, each Puran describes it with some additional detail. And if you are sharp enough to remember the details, then suddenly you realize, my God, if I put all these 3 or 4 stories, renditions of these stories, right, the same story together, there is a lot more detail here than what I knew, what I learned from either a TV serial or something else, right? And that's the first time that I realized that there's something else that's going on here, that there is much more detail here than I anticipated. I didn't anticipate it. And then as I kept reading, this thing began to grow on me. And then the first thing that I made that I could kind of get my head around was the moon, the story of the moon. Because even as a child, I used to think, these are our holy texts, and we have the moon having 27 wives. I mean, why does the moon have to have 27 wives, right? If he has to tell us a story, he could tell us a story with 5 wives, and we'd be just as illuminated, or just as we'll understand it just as well. So, and that's the first thing that came across to me. Okay, so they're talking about the moon and the constellations and the path of the moon through the constellations. And then slowly then I realized I had to go back, and now when I was interested in my space science, I used to just read it, right? I was not but I had to go back and study it again to see, well, if there is congruence, alignment between these two. So I had to go back and study, and then I started this process over and over again. And then at some point in time, I realized I couldn't read anymore, because all of this research, I just had to put it out there. I mean, I had to get it out of my system. And so, like I said, I have no formal training in writing, because I never imagined I'd be a writer. I'm an engineer, basically, in an MBA. I was mostly into business. But almost as therapy, I had to start writing this thing. I had to just get it out. And I had to self-publish it, because who's going to publish a book about the Puranas, about a first-time writer who has no background on the Puranas? And by the grace of God, it's done well. People have reacted well to it. And so, long story, but like I said, the short answer is I never imagined I'd write a book. And here I am actually talking about it, discussing it with you. And that was one of the reasons, because it was sitting in my head. And I thought to myself, if I went to my dear friends, right, people from an IIT, right, and I told them, listen, I think the Puranas talk about the red giant face of the sun. Even if he was my best friend, he would probably tell me to get a good night's sleep and come back and talk to him tomorrow, right? Because it just doesn't add up, right? No, it wouldn't add up for anybody. So I went through a very painful process. I had to write out a draft of the book, and not a book, like 5 chapters. I had to very gently give it to a friend and say, can you please read it? Because I'm not sure it makes sense, and you let me know if it makes sense. And he was a very well-read individual, very dear friend, very well-read individual, also an engineer from an IIT. And he said, yeah, it makes sense. I think you should do a little, obviously it was very raw, but he said you should do a little more work on it, and so on and so forth. And almost after a year of reading, rereading, writing, rewriting, the book came to me. So it was, I never imagined I'd be here, Kushal. Maybe that's probably the short answer. I never imagined I'd write a book. I never imagined I'd write a book on the Puranas, let alone write a book at all. So that's life takes us where we go there.
All right. So, Ganesh, now as you had made a small presentation about the book, so what we're going to do now is I'll share your presentation. And so here's how it goes. In today's session, we're going to be first having a small presentation that Ganesh has prepared for us. Ganesh is going to go through the entire presentation. He's going to make his points on the book. And then credit to Ganesh. Ganesh knows that this is the Cārvāka podcast, and since the last month and a half, Ganesh and I have been having a very healthy email exchange where I've asked a few questions. So first, what we'll do is let Ganesh make his points about the book, and then maybe I will ask a few questions to Ganesh after that. And then, if anybody watching this live has any questions, maybe they can ask a few questions, and they will, we will wrap it up accordingly. So Ganesh, I'm going to move on and present your first slide now. So please go for it.
Yeah. So thanks, Kushal. So like I said, maybe as I started with, most of us, many of us have heard stories about the sun, the moon, and stars from the Puranas, right? And the book that I've written, that I published recently, it shows, just to kind of boil it down, it shows a couple of things. First thing is that it is a very consistent description of the universe. And I use the word consistent because we hear a story of the sun, then we hear a story of the moon, then we hear a story about some star, and we don't know whether these things work together. And these are actually a very consistent because they follow a narrative of the universe. They follow a consistent narrative of the universe, right? And one more thing, this book has no. So I'm as an author, I think I should just make it up, clarify up front about what the book is not. The book is not a spiritual book at all. Even though it's about the Puranas, there is no religion, there's no philosophy. It's the science and it's the Puranas. That's it, right? So it's like the title, a subtitle of the book says Modern Science in the Puranas. So every section starts with the science, because a lot of us don't know the science, right? Because unless you're really interested in astrophysics, you wouldn't need to know about it. And then it says what the Purana says, and then it allows the reader to draw conclusions for themselves. And obviously, I have a point of view that I want to bring out, and I share that as well, but that's where it is. So the first thing is that it has a very consistent description of the universe. So when you put all the stories together, they add up. They make sense together. They are not just independent stories that we have to talk about. The second thing is that the description is close to science, right? And the third thing is it includes concepts from a few decades ago. So it's not just, Newton's laws of motion that were discovered 300 years ago. It's stuff that we are still discovering now, right? And so that's probably the best way to summarize this. Let's go to the next slide. So a few words about the Puranas. Not many of us read the Puranas, so I thought maybe it's useful to just kind of set some context. The Puranas are not just a collection of stories, right? The Purana Samhita is 18 Mahapuranas and many Upapuranas. And it's considered to be about 1,500 to 2,000 years old. So I don't want to get into a lot of detail, but in that range, broadly speaking. They are encyclopedic. So they contain religion, they contain philosophy, they contain many sciences, right? They contain everything from medicine to the science of music and temple architecture, a whole bunch of stuff, right? Astronomy. And the universe and its origins is one of the aspects of the Puranas. And when I'm writing about the Puranas, I'm writing about maybe about 10% of the Puranas, right? There's 90% that, in all honesty, I probably don't understand, because I don't have the training I have not had the personal interest to follow up on the philosophical aspect or the science of music or something of that sort. And this story of the universe, this narrative of the universe, is communicated through stories and descriptions. So the stories people remember stories, right? That's why stories are made. So we remember the stories, but there's also a lot of description. And what I'll do is, over the next few slides, I'll give you some examples of what the Puranas say about the universe, right? And we'll start with the Earth, and we'll build it up to the entire solar system. So let's go to the next slide. So let's start with the Earth, right? The Puranas describe the Earth as a sphere, right? So that, for a lot of people, may or may not sound surprising. Most of us know the Earth is a sphere. But 2,000 years ago, this was big science. It was a big deal, right? And so you can actually see this verse. I cited this verse from the Bhagavata Purana. It says, "This your bow form consisting of the three Vedas," this is talking about the Varaha Avtara of Vishnu, "with the sphere of the earth supported by your tusk appears shining like a great, enchantingly beautiful Kula Parvata with a cloud resting on its peak." So every time I cite a verse, I'll tell you the Purana that it's from, the book, the chapter, the verse. So it's not just a claim. You can go back, and anybody that's interested can go back and validate what I'm presenting here, number one. The second thing I want to say is that this is not my translation, right? First thing, I don't have knowledge of Sanskrit to be able to translate this, and besides, this is Vedic Sanskrit, so it's a different level. This translation, most of the translations are by a board of scholars that were set up. It was a whole team of people set up by the government of India in the 50s to translate the Puranas and make them accessible to the world at large, right? So they were translated into English and published by Motilal Banarsi Das. I have just underlined sphere to show you the fact that it talks about the earth as a sphere. And this is one verse. There are you can find at least a dozen verses, half a dozen verses in every Purana that talk about this. Right? Can we go to the next click again? Click, yeah. Yeah, so it talks about the size, right? So the verse from the Vayu Purana says from Kumari to the source of Ganga spread along its northern circuitous way, it extends 9,000 yojanas. So this is from the Vayu Purana. And so first thing is, it again talks about the circuitous way. That means it talks about the surface of the earth as being a part of a sphere, right? If you click again, Kushal, one more time. Just click again. So now the Kumari is the Kanyakumari, and the source of the Ganga is Gangotri. And you can go to Google Maps and you know that the physical distance between the two is about 2,600 kilometers. So now you have an equation, right? You have 9,000 yojanas is equal to 2,600 kilometers. Now you'll find virtually in every Purana, in the description of the Jambudvipa, it says that it has an extent of about 100,000 yojana. Now use this formula and convert the 100,000 yojana, you'll get about 28,800 kilometers. And this is the extent of the land. It's the extent of the land mass of the earth, not the entire earth, the land mass of the earth. Okay. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about the geography, right? So this is from the Vayu Purana again. It says the Jambudvipa is vast. So I just want to clarify one more thing, Kushal. I didn't mention that I had read the Vayu Purana. In the list of Puranas that I had read 7 Puranas. But when I had to start writing, I had to research all the Puranas because I wanted to make sure that I was not just getting one piece of it from one Purana that pointed me in one direction. Most of what I'm saying will find reflection in many of the Puranas, but I chose the verse that I thought fitted the context best and told the story best. That's all. I mean, you'll find pretty much the same thing in all the Puranas, okay? Now, it says, Jambudvipa is vast and endowed with glory and surrounded or engirt all round by 9 khandas, inhabited by living beings. It is engirt all over by the Lavana ocean or salt ocean, right? It's Vayu Purana. So the first thing I want to point out, it says it's inhabited by living beings. So which means it points to the planet Earth. So Jambudvipa is the planet Earth where all living beings, all of us, live on the planet. The second thing I want to point out is the term salt ocean. So the salt ocean actually means the ocean of salt water. So to summarize, what it says is that the Jambudvipa is basically a big mass of land surrounded all around by an ocean of salt water. So if you click again, Kushal, and if you look from above the North Pole, right, you will see the exact same figure. You will see, this is what is called the northern polar view of the Earth. And you will see the entire landmass in the center. It is surrounded by the salt ocean. And it's described in a lot more detail in the book, but you get the idea. And you might ask, why the North Pole? Because North Pole is associated with Mount Meru, which is the abode of the gods, right? And so you look from above the abode of the gods, and you see this view, right? And this is what is described as the geography. Can we go to the next slide? So let's look at the geological history, the events in history, right? So when we talk about history, written history goes back not more than 10,000 years, maximum, right? If you put in the Egyptian and all the rest put together, the maximum it can go back is about 8,000, max 10,000 years, right? But if you want to go really far back into the Earth's past, you have to look at geology. And so when you look at geology, you look at things like ice ages, volcanic eruptions, mass extinctions. And one of the big things in the history of the Earth is the origin of the Earth's waters. So today, scientists agree that most of the waters in the Earth's oceans came from outside, from extraterrestrial sources, from outer space, right? And they came to us in the form of comets and asteroids. So comets is basically frozen water. So as it comes into the Earth, the water just evaporates and then over time falls as rain. Asteroids, when they come in, they burn, and they have about 3 to 5% water. They don't have much water, but because over 1 billion years, a lot of water can flow, or hundreds of millions of years, a lot of water can flow in. So click again, next slide. Here is a verse from the Brahmanda Purana. It says, though their waters had been dried up when Agastya drank up the waters, the 4 oceans became full with the waters of Ganga once again. So the descent of Ganga, the story of descent of Ganga that we all know, that we all are familiar with at least, or have heard about, is not just the holy river that is not just the river in the north of India that we consider holy. It is the descent of the waters to the planet and the waters filling up all of the Earth's oceans, right? So it's a pretty big event in the Earth's history. And obviously, I'm giving you just one verse. There is a whole passage on this. I mean, obviously, a passage on this which describes it in an amazing amount of detail. So we don't have time to go into it. Just click one more time. I think there's one more detail here. Yeah. The story of sage Agastya drinking up is another event in the history, and it's called the Paleocene era. You can actually time these things because the Puranas talk about the Chatur Yuga and the Manvantara and so on. So you can get a sense for when this thing is happening. And we have evidence of an event like this in the Paleocene era when the waters could have gotten dried up. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Let's go to the next slide. So we did the Earth, let's go to the sun. So the Puranas talk about the distance. So remember, we are talking about this in a document 2000 years ago, right? All of this may sound, yeah, we know all this stuff, right? But this is a document 2000 years ago. And now we're going to talk about stuff that we don't even know today. A lot of us may not know today. So the Puranas talk about the distance of the sun from the Earth, which is about 150 million years and have kilometers, and they are off by about, they're not accurate, they're off by about 15% or so. But interestingly, they talk about the sun today is a star, right? It's just one of the billions of stars in the universe, and it has a life cycle just like every star has. And modern science ascribes 5 stages to its life cycle. So I'm not going into a lot of detail here. So there's birth, which is obvious. There is a very young stage called a T Tauri star. There is a current stage called a main sequence star, which is the sun that we see in the skies today. So in about 6 to 8 billion years, it will become what is called a red giant. So the sun actually grows enormously in size. It swallows up the planets of Mercury, Venus, and finally even Earth, right? And then when all the fuel in it has run out, it just collapses into a very small size, and it's called a white dwarf. And then it dies and just fades away, right? So this is the 5-stage life cycle of the sun. Now, you're not going to believe this, but the Puranas talk about each of these stages. So if you click once more, Kushal. So the story of the birth of the sun is the story of the birth of Martanda. Martanda is born of Kashyapa and Aditi. The story of the juvenile stage with the sun is the story of the marriage of Samjana, who is the daughter of Vishwakarman and Vivaswan. And you'll not believe this, but the current sun and the red giant sun and the white dwarf sun are actually descriptions in the Brahmanda Purana. So just like a small elementary textbook would just describe it stage by stage, it is described stage by stage. So quite amazing. Can we go to the next slide? So in the same context, we have large cycles of time because the life cycle of the sun is about 10 billion years. And this is the same order of magnitude as a kalpa. So you have to ask yourself, take yourself back 2000 years ago. Why would you even need a number like a billion, right? There is not $1 billion. There's not 1 billion people. Unless you're counting grains of rice or stars in the sky or something. You don't need 1 billion as a number, let alone have a unit of 1 billion years as something that people talk about. I mean, there's absolutely no necessity in an agrarian society of having a 4.3 billion year as a unit of time. But when you look at it as describing the life of a sun, then it becomes very clear. So the life of a sun is there's about 7 billion years left, and a kalpa is the same order of magnitude, about 4.3 billion years. A kalpa is 1,000 Chatur Yuga, so each Chatur Yuga is 4.32 million years. And we know the Krita Dwapara, Krita Treta Dwapara, and the Kali Yuga. So if you click again, and this is the verse in the Skanda Purana. It says, when 1,000 yugas are complete, a kalpa is said to have come to a close, then all living beings are burnt by the rays of the sun. And I just talked to you 2 slides back about the red giant sun growing in size and just burning up the earth, right? And so the Skanda Purana doesn't describe it in detail. The Brahmanda Purana describes it in great detail. And I just presented a paper on this a couple of weeks back, actually. I mentioned this to Kushal. You might remember this. And very well accepted. And so you can see that not only so this entire event, along with the kalpa of 4 billion years, is recorded in our texts, right? Just as a scientific fact. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, the moon, right? So we did the sun. So it describes the size and the distance of the moon reasonably well. It talks about the tides on Earth. Right. And so now we know that there are the phases of the moon. There's the new moon, there's the full moon, and then the other moons in between. And this causes rise and fall of tides and on the planet, right? So water rises, seawater rises and falls. Now, this was suggested to modern science 500 years ago, around the time of Kepler, but it was actually accepted only 300 years ago. And if you click one more time, Kushal, you see the verse in the Puranas. During the bright and dark fortnights, when the moon rises and sets, the waters in the sea increase and decrease in a quantity that is neither more nor less than usual. So it very clearly makes a connection between the moon phase and the rise and setting of tides. So again, quite surprising, quite amazing. Let's go to the next slide. This is really interesting. So the moon, our moon is not the north. There are many of the planets in the solar system have moons. Our moon is the most unique moon of them all, right? And I'm not going to get into a detail, but just take my word for it. So the current view of the origin of the moon is called the giant impact hypothesis. Now it's a pretty long hypothesis, but very briefly, it has 3 parts. There was an impact many billion years ago of a Mars-sized planet with the Earth. Obviously, the impact was very violent, right? And it created a huge mass of dust which orbited the planet Earth as a debris disk, as a disk of debris, right? And over a period of time, as this disk of debris just orbited the Earth, there is a process called accretion, out of which such a disk will form small heavenly bodies. For example, the formation of the Earth, when the solar system was very young, it was actually just a disk of dust around the sun. And out of that disk of sun, through the same process of accretion, planets formed. So you just formed the dust that just got into clumps, and those clumps became the various planets. Similarly, just like the formation of the Earth, the moon formed a clump, and just by its own gravitation, essentially, maybe that's the best way to describe it. So it formed the moon, right? So this is the science. If you go to the next one, it says, so the story of many of us know the story of Moon and Rohini, but few of us know the full story, and it is given in the Kalika Purana. It's described over some 200 verses or so, some 2 full chapters. It's a very extensive description of the impact. And many of us know the story of the churning of the milk ocean. And if you recall the story of the churning of the milk ocean, one of the first things to come out of the churning of the milk ocean was the moon, or after the hala hala. So first thing, you had the hala hala poison that came out of the churning of the milk ocean, and then you have the coming of the moon. And the book demonstrates how closely these two, the sciences and how these stories are. Can we go to the next slide? So we did the sun, the earth, and the moon. So let's go to the Brahmanda, which is the solar system equivalent, right? So the Puranas do not mention either of the 2 outer planets Uranus or Neptune. Is nowhere in the Puranas are these two planets mentioned. They don't show up in the Panchanga, in the Nakshatra system. They just don't exist as far as the Indian texts are concerned. So let's just kind of deal with that. Saturn is about 1.5 billion kilometers from the sun, right? Which is about roughly, let's just say about 10 times the distance of the Earth from the sun, right? So that's that gives you an idea of the distance, right? And the verse in the Purana says, the entire Earth is remembered as 50 crores of yojana as an extent, right? So when you take 50 crores yojana, that's the diameter. If you convert it to radius and then convert it into kilometers, it basically maps to the solar system all the way to Saturn. So it goes beyond Saturn all the way to the right up close to Uranus, but not including Uranus, right? And then many of the Puranas talk about the Earth as the center of this Brahmanda, but the Bhagavata Purana puts the sun as the center of the Brahmanda, and it says the sun is located in the middle of this great egg of the universe. Right now, these are not in conflict with each other. Geometrically speaking, the Brahmanda is so large, and the Earth and the sun are so close to each other that the difference is about 4% in the overall scheme of things. So it's, observationally, it doesn't make much difference, geometrically speaking. So, but it's described quite well. Okay, can we go to the next slide? And beyond the Brahmanda, we have what are called the sheets of the Brahmanda, and we have what is called the interstellar medium. So once you leave the solar system, you leave the solar system, and you're in the space between the stars, and that is called the interstellar medium. So the Brahmanda Purana the Brahmanda is described as having 4 sheets. It has water, fire, air, and ether. And let me talk to you about the first couple, right? So the first sheet is water. So it's hard to imagine the Brahmanda being covered with water. But the reality is that there is a shell of ice, rocks of ice, right? So there's a shell of space around the solar system, which has many big chunks of ice in it, right? So it's frozen water, right? And this is the source of all the what is called the long period comets. So you can just Google Oort cloud, and you will, there's a lot of description you can find. So comets are of 2 types, which are the short period comets, which come back every 50, 60 years or 100 years. And then there are long period comets, which take more than 200-300 years to come back, right? They come back to the center of the solar system beyond 200 years. So these long period comets originate from the Oort cloud, and it's not been observed, but it's pretty well defined. I'll come to the fire later, but let's talk about the space between the stars and the solar system, right? I make a comment saying complete absence of light. So it might sound strange. We think of the space as being dark, right? Completely pitch dark. But the reality is there's plenty of sunlight there. So every time you send a spacecraft out, it has a big solar panels, right, which capture the light of the sun, and they convert it to energy and power the spacecraft. But once you leave the solar system, the sun becomes like one of the stars in the sky. So there's virtually no light, and it becomes completely dark. And so this is the verse in the Puranas. So it says, it's endless and unmanifest. It is boundless. It is non-self-possessed. It has neither beginning nor end. It is unknown even to the devas. It is devoid of all activities. It is well known as the extremity of darkness. Such a beautiful description of the interstellar medium, where there's actually no light, no activity, and there's just infinite space practically there. Right? Just click one more time. And I wanted to come back to this fire discovered by the world. So when you think of outer space is not only dark, it is bitterly cold. It is cold to the extent of absolute zero. So it is minus 270 degrees centigrade in space, right? And to think of fire being there, it just doesn't make sense, right? The reality is there are 2 space probes that NASA sent out called the Voyager space probes. And they just left they sent it about 20 some years ago. They just exited the solar system a couple of years back. And what did they find? They found a huge wall of fire. So you can actually Google this. You can Google NASA wall of fire. and you'll come up with this sheet of plasma, which is 50,000 degrees centigrade, extremely hot. Now, this sheet, now 50,000 degrees centigrade can fry most spacecraft, right? Fry everything basically. But because it had a heat shield, because you need a heat shield for it to get out of the Earth, right? Because of the heat created, and because it was traveling at very high speed and this region was quite short, it managed to get through it without getting destroyed, and it's still sending signals to Earth. So the Voyager spacecraft is still alive. And I like to say this half jokingly: if the NASA scientists had read the Puranas, they would have planned for this, because this hit them like a complete surprise. They had no idea that this thing was out there. So let's go to the next slide. So I want to leave you with a few thoughts to set some context for our discussion. So look at the Puranas as an encyclopedia of knowledge, not as just a collection of stories. One of the topics that is covered is about the universe and its origins. And the descriptions in the text is very close to science. So when I say close to science, let me give you an example. I talked to you about the sheath of fire. That sheath of fire is actually not mentioned in the book. It's not mentioned in the book because when I was researching it 2 years ago, I had no idea that it was there. It had not been reported yet, right? 2.5 years ago, when I was researching this. And so I thought, okay, it's something I don't understand. But I sent the manuscript to the publisher, and then I realized it's going on and I didn't want to rewrite it. So science is not static, right? It's not today's science. Science works on a process of observation and learning and building on that observation. So unless you have evidence, you cannot have science. And as we have more and more observations, especially in cosmology, we'll have more and more science. And my guess is that we will understand our Puranas also better in the process of discovery. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Kushal. I hope that there's a lot of ground that's covered. I hope it gives you a sense of some of the ground that's covered. Yeah.
All right, so now time for some of the questions that I had in my mind. So okay, let me put it this way. So my first question is that, so when you were going about writing this book, Ganesh, so how do you decide which verse of the Purana intends to say what? Now what I'm trying to say is, how do you know what meaning is intended in which verse? So I'll give you an example. So in chapter 2, there is this verse you share, I think it was 276 and 278, where it is, in the beginning the Holy Lord created an egg with her belly, the powerful fetus was within the egg. And then it goes on to describe how describe the egg as it was born. In 284 to 288, it is like, when it was taken out of the belly, it resembled a dead lump. Since he was born dead, Mrita, as an egg under, Savitri the sun is called Martanda by the learned men. This is the Brahmanda Purana, book 2, section 3, chapter 7. Now, why should we not take the Vivaswan and Samnya story in a different way and not literally? So again, my question is the problem of which verse do we decide to take literally, which verse do we decide to take in a slightly metaphorical way? Where is the measurement criteria? What is the qualitative standard where we come up and desire this in a standard manner?
Very good. Good question. So I didn't mention this at the beginning. So like I said, I'm trained as an engineer, and we have metrics, right? As an engineer, unless you have metrics, you just can't just make a statement. So at the beginning of the book, I actually state this in the book. I set myself 3 tests, if I can use the word, right? Because it's possible to spin a story, right? You can just read some verses and say, oh, this is what it means. So how do you quantify yourself that it's so the 3 tests were, first thing is that it should be consistent. So whatever story that you put together, it should be internally consistent as a story, right? It shouldn't just be random facts that have just been assembled together. The second test is that it should be close to science, right? I am a person of science, and to me that's the benchmark, right? Because science is established on the basis of evidence, and so if it's based on science, then you know that it is close to some evidence that kind of supports it. And the third thing is that I looked at these as separate narratives. So I came up with a narrative for the moon, for the sun, for the earth, for the planets and the lokas and so on, right? And the question was, do these things actually work with each other? So it's not easy. It's possible to come up with 5 different narratives, but are there actually instances in the Puranas where a certain part of the narrative of the earth works well with the narrative of space, of the Brahmanda, or certain part of the narrative of the sun works well with the narrative of Brahmanda, and so on and so forth. So do these things work well amongst each other, right? So that's the internal consistency test, the 2 internal consistency tests where does the narrative function by itself? And does the narrative work with other narratives? And the external consistency test is, does it work with science? And the final thing that I actually end the book with, and I don't know if you kind of got there, is, okay, so we kind of got a story. So what, right? So I said, okay, we need to be able to put together a list of events, right? And so the title of the book is From the Beginning of Time. And when I say from the beginning of time, I say it's from the beginning of the current creation, which is the current Varaha Kalpa, which is about 2 billion years. So I say, let's start at 2 billion years ago, right? And let's say what you can, so the events in the Puranas actually they either describe the Manvantara, or they describe the Chaturyuga, or they describe some detail about the time. So use that detail about the time and see, are there some geological evidences that can support what you're saying. So not only do you have the scientific thing, but you actually I have tried to look for evidence from a geological perspective. So like I said, so these are the 4 tests that I kind of put together. And then let's go back to specifically the sun, right? So when I first read the story of Martanda, you made specifically that comment. It was not obvious to me. I'll just be very upfront with you. It's when I got to the description of the red giant sun, and there is no sage or god or anything in the description of the red. It's a pure description, right? When I saw the description of the white dwarf sun, when I saw the current description of the sun, let me give you one more example. The Puranas, the Brahmanda Purana and a couple Vayu Purana also has a description of the water cycle. Now the water cycle is a 2,000-year-old text, right? The water cycle was suggested about 400 years ago by a French hydrologist, by a French engineer, and accepted by modern science about 300 years ago. Again, it kind of just startled me to see things like these being mentioned in the detail in the Puranas, right? So I say, okay, it describes the current sun well, it describes the red giant sun well, it describes the white dwarf sun well. Then let me go back and see. Then I go back and see whether this Samjana story looks very similar to what I would expect of the young adolescent son, the juvenile son, the young son, basically. So I have to go and do some research. I have to read it. So then I have to put together all the information. I have to look at the various, how should I say it, various renditions. So each Purana will tell the same story, but it will add some more detail. So I have to bring all those details together and say, okay, now with all the detail that I have, does it match what I expect of it from a scientific standpoint? So those are the ways I go step by step and build it up. But I can't just go to one, say, I know what the story is. It took me a long time. Like I said, it was after my 4th Purana that I really got the hang of, oh, there's actually something that's going on here that I need to kind of pay more attention to. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, but then I have a follow-up. So the problem, Ganesh, over here is that, it's what you pick from what verse. So let's say Brahmanda Purana 1, 2, 22, 41, it says the wings of very powerful mountains that had increased in size and who used to go wherever as they pleased were chopped off by Indra, who wished to secure the welfare of all living beings. Now, what am I supposed to make of this verse, right? I'm just using this as an example. This is the G.V. Tagore translation that I'm using here.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
So the short answer is there is a lot in the Puranas that you don't understand. So look at it this way. There's probably 0% that you understood before, or maybe 1 or 2% that from the cosmology standpoint. Maybe we understand 20 to 30% now, 20% now of the of the cosmology part of it, right? And I would be very arrogant if I thought, or if I tried to tell you that I have a complete understanding of the whole thing. So what I've tried to say in the book is that this is a framework, right? I'm also not an expert solar scientist. Right? I don't think there's any one person who's an expert Puranic scholar and a solar scientist and a geologist and a scientist on the moon, and so on and so. It's not possible. So I say, okay, at least if we can create a framework, then we can reach out to individual experts and say, do these verses match what you expect? And so that is what I'm doing now. So I've kind of focused on just the red giant sun, right? Just that one piece. I've written a paper where I've taken all the research material that is available, and I'm reaching out to professors who teach astronomy, right? And say, does this make sense to you, right? I'm given both of these things. So I think we need to kind of work through this. I don't know that there is a silver bullet that will fix everything, that will give us all the answers.
Yeah.
And I
get it. I get it that, as far as astronomy is concerned, there are these, but Ganesh, I don't know how to put it, but if you make a claim that the Puranas are compatible with modern science, but I've read a few Puranas, but there are, modern science is not just about astronomy. It is about, let's say, embryology. It is about pregnancy. It is about many things. And when, a lot of times when you go through the Puranas and a lot of claims that are made in those sections and in those claims about the Puranas, and I can cite verses. It's not that I'm talking out of the top of my head.
No, I completely agree with you. Yeah. No.
So to make a statement, so here's my question. So to make a statement like that, so when you say it is scientific, are you trying to say that it is partially compatible when it comes to certain astronomical claims, or
maybe
that's your point?
That's probably the point. Because I have no expert. I actually don't even have expertise in the science of the sun. Yeah, just to be very upfront with you, right? I just think it's very close. I have so in fact, in my previous interviews, I invite people of other expertise to go and read the Puranas. So if you're a medical professional, right? That medical professional probably has a better opinion on the Puranas and the embryology or things like that than I might have, right? I'm a self-taught astronomer at best today. And so I don't want to make any claim about this because I have no idea. And at least even for cosmology is something that I have no formal training, but I've spent a lot of time with it. And I'm also humble enough to understand that I'm still not the expert. I still need to reach out to other people and get validation from them. But unless I put all my thoughts in a book, we cannot even have this conversation. That is the beginning of a conversation, is to make a statement out there saying, this is what I think it is. Let's figure out whether it makes sense or it needs to be tweaked or something of that sort. I'm not close to that idea at all.
All right. So another query that I had, and this is something I've actually asked a lot of people in my life. So it's interesting to me every time I have this conversation with people. And once again, I want to put it on record that this is not coming from a place of trying to put anybody or any set of people down. This is coming from a genuine space of curiosity, when it comes to me at least.
Right.
Where I've always found this thing very fascinating, that why I find this whole process of trying to find science within these ancient texts itself. Now, why is it necessary that some ancient books have to be compatible with what we like to call modern science or the scientific method? First of all, I don't think so there is anything called modern science. I believe science is a method which has been followed by people since eons. Maybe they did not write it down in a proper way.
Let me go back. How long has science been followed? I completely agree with you. So how many years maybe a couple of 200-300 years? How long do you think modern science has been followed?
See, modern science, as we call it, in fact, the Western claim has always been nothing more than maybe the last 2000 years. I disagree with that. I believe the scientific method, which is basically, having an idea, creating a hypothesis, gathering data, testing the hypothesis, looking at the results, then replicating it after a while, and then formulating the claim, is a very modern method. Having said that, it does not mean that something like this method has not been practiced since time immemorial. Human beings have been doing it for a while. But my question is this: why is it necessary for this is not about the Puranas itself. I see this happening with people doing it with the Quran, people do it with the Bible, people do it with the Vedas, people do it with Greek books, Plato's Republic, many other books. My point is, the moment somebody says, okay, this book is scientific, the by a priori assumption that draws in my brain is that you're putting science at a certain pedestal, which is superior to other memes. I'm not even I could care less personally. When I read the Bhagavad Gita, I'm just reading the Bhagavad Gita. When I'm reading a scientific text, I'm reading a scientific text. It doesn't matter whether one complies with the other or one contradicts the other, to me, at a personal level. But my question is that why is it necessary for the two to match each other?
Okay. So good question, long question. Let me try and break it up into two parts, right? The first part is, why does, as a person that's grown up as a student of science, the minute I see this correlation, to me, it jumps out, right? It's like, oh, this is too similar. It's surprising. Maybe I just use the word surprising at this point. Yeah. The second thing that I want to say is, all science, Kushal, all science starts with a correlation, right? Where you say, Aristotle, many millennia ago, started out with the saying that all moving bodies come to rest, because that's what he observed, right? That was his science, right? Because every time a chariot ran up, it would come to a halt, or he pushed something, it would come to a halt. So unlike today's Newton's laws of motion, where it says a body will continue in motion as long as, forever, he actually said that it will come to a rest, because that's what he observed. So, so observation has been going on for a long time, but observation is the start of science. Is the first step in science is observation. And to me, and science, you said, is a process, so it's very well said. So in the scientific process, the first step is observing correlation, right? And so, for example, if you're doing astronomy and you're studying hundreds of stars or thousands of stars, and suddenly a pattern emerges in your studying of, when you see whether the size of the star or the color of the star or whatever, right? And then you say, aha, I have an insight here. So that pattern that you see is the beginning of science. It leads you to form your first hypothesis. And so this correlation is a pattern that you're seeing in terms of compatibility between science and the ancient text. So it's the start of an insight, basically, right? You don't know it because you have to still validate it, but you say, hey, maybe there is something that's going on here that needs to be validated. So understanding correlation between two different things is a part of the scientific process, right? Because it's the first part of any scientific process is to understand correlation. The second thing you said is why do the Puranas need to be scientific? And this again was an aha thing for me. The Puranas don't need to be scientific because the Brahmanda Purana actually talks about the scientific process. Right? The scientific process that we talk about now. Remember, even though we talk about the observation, the hypothesis, the testing, and so on as the part of modern process, all of it was lost during the Dark Ages, right? So it's again around the Renaissance, around the 15th century, that it restarted again. The idea of science restarted again after the church loosed its reins and so on and so forth. So in the modern sense, it's about 500 years old, 500 to 600 years old, really. But here you have, again, in the Puranas, you have a verse in the Brahmanda Purana that I think I mentioned in the book, where it says, and I thought this was phenomenal. It says, the learned man, I'm speaking from memory here, so I might not remember the full words. I'm going to paraphrase it. It says something along the lines of, the learned man acquires knowledge through scripture, observation, inference, and reasoning. 4 things they talk about, right? And it goes on to say, they should not accept this as knowledge. Learned people should not accept this as knowledge unless they test it, right? And the testing is through evidence, or what we call pramana, right? Or what we just call running an experiment is a pramana, basically, right? And so it is amazing in 2 things. First thing is, it talks about the scientific process in the Brahmanda Purana, right? It talks about the fact is that what you observe is um, at best and a hypothesis. Unless you actually put it to test, then it becomes real knowledge, right? So it actually makes this separation between seeing what you see and then accepting it as knowledge. That's the first thing. The second thing it does is it points to the scriptures as one of the sources of information and includes that to be tested as well. So basically the verse says that even what you read in the scriptures you should test. To my mind, that is the highest level um, of engagement that you can talk about, in any sense, because you are generally most religious texts, right? They say what I'm saying is the absolute truth, and it's not to be denied and not to be argued with. And here is a text that we consider canon, which says, read what is written here, but please analyze it for yourself and test it for yourself before you accept it as knowledge. And so this scientific process is something inherent in the Puranas, and I think we should not treat it as something that's separate that we are trying to marry. I think we need to look at it as a part of what Puranas teaches us. So that, I don't know, long answer, but I don't want us to look at the science as a pedestal. I want to look at science as a pedestal in some form, because we look at it, we reach the scientific knowledge through an evidentiary process, right? So that is important. What I want to also say is that the Puranas are not divorced from this evidentiary process. They also encourage this evidentiary process. And so in that sense, it's not in a pedestal, it's inherent in the way we look at the Puranas.
Okay, so then my follow-up to that, Ganesh, would be that I think there is a problem here, and that is about the language, right? Now, what we find a lot of times in a lot of books, I mean, I remember a while ago, I think Professor Makarand Paranjape had written a beautiful article about this in 2017 in Swarajya magazine. Now, I want to read you an excerpt from that. It was about Swami Vivekananda and Tesla, and how Nikola Tesla and Vivekananda had a interaction. Now, I'm just going to read something in the end where Professor Paranjape says modern physics is busy grappling with the issues of expansion of this universe, the cosmological constant, the fundamental particles that arose right after the Big Bang explosion, the unified field theory, and so on. But the question alluded to indirectly by Vivekananda, namely, what gives rise to Akasha and Prana, is even today considered metaphysics rather than physics. Moreover,
Correct.
The moment of quantum mysticism has also passed. Appropriated by New Age faddists, attempts to connect physics with Eastern philosophy have come to be regarded by most practicing scientists as pseudoscience or quackery. Despite brave attempts by the likes of Amit Goswami, the desire to offer a Vedantic picture of the universe that also satisfied the truth conditions and methodological demands of contemporary physics may be said to have largely failed. Nevertheless, what we notice are interesting parallels in the manner in which the two sides conceptualize or imagine reality. Now, here's the thing. This is the key part. These parallels or resemblances are mostly metaphorical. That is, they create the effect of narrative likeness. However, the two languages, that of science and spirituality, are distinct without no possibility of overlap, at least at present. The language of science, no matter how closely it may seem to that of spirituality, is actually mathematics with precise sounding equations and fixity of meaning. The proof is through experimental verification. The theory must fit the data. The language of spirituality, on the other hand, is poetic, reveling in figurative language, open to 100 different interpretations. It is impossible, therefore, to collapse the one into the other. I think this pretty much sums up the parallels between the Puranas and modern science too, don't you think?
Wrong, right? Swami Vivekananda is approaching it from a spirituality. I made a clarification right in the beginning. There is no spirituality in this book at all. Zero, right? It just talks about science, and it talks about the Puranas, and it talks about parallels. That's it. And you may like the parallels. You may say, I'm interesting, but I'm not interested in it. But that's as far as it goes. Spirituality, by its definition, talks about a different plane of our existence, right? And maybe our vocabulary has to be what it has to be. It can't be the vocabulary of equations and so on, that as an engineer that I feel comfortable with. right? So I don't want to go into the world of spirituality, not because I don't believe it. I have a belief in it. That's a separate thing. But I'm not able to put an equation around it or put an equivalence around it. That is very hard. And so to me, it's very personal, and it stays personal. But when I see a description of the red giant sun in the Puranas, there is no spirituality in the Puranas relating to the red giant sun. It is a step-by-step description of what happens to the sun and the earth as the sun grows in size and swallows up the earth. There is no room for spirituality here. It's a hard science. It's just a description. And so when I look at it, I say, so, and now stepping back a little bit, the Puranas also talk about philosophy. I'm not dealing with philosophy. Puranas talk about a lot of things. So like I said, the description of the universe is probably 10% of the Puranas, right? There's a 90% of the Puranas that I don't feel competent to deal with, quite simply. It's only the 10%, and I feel comfortable interpreting a part of this 10%, right? Maybe about, say, 30% of this 10%, right? So we are down to right about 3% of the Puranas, right? If you just do the numbers. So two things: there is no spirituality that I'm talking about. Each of us are spiritual beings. Some of us may choose to acknowledge it. Some of us may choose not to acknowledge it, and that's a personal choice. I choose to acknowledge it, but that's nowhere reflected in the book. I don't want to talk about it in the book because that's not where. I'm not. I don't feel competent enough to be able to make a good equation there. Maybe that's the best way to say it. So I think. First thing, I'm not aware of this interesting article that you talked about, and I would not venture into trying to marry spirituality. Though so my personal feeling is that maybe in 15 years we'll get there. Maybe, right? I just feel because of the lot of work that's being done around consciousness and so on, maybe we'll get there. But we're not there today. We're really not there today. At least not to my comprehension, right? Nothing that I can articulate. I can either comprehend or articulate. And what I can see and articulate is cosmology. And cosmology is very real. There are equations around how the earth grows in size, how the sun grows in size and swallows up the earth. It is a very physical process. And that process has an impact on the earth. And that process is very clearly defined in the Puranas. Now, the question remains, how would the Puranic texts know this? And the answer is, I don't know, right? It's a very honest answer. I don't know, right? That doesn't mean, so we can break this up into two questions, right? What is the information they contain? How did they get this information? These are two separate questions and two separate fields of inquiry. I think we are at the beginning parts of the first question, right? In the first innings of the first question, right? Maybe first opening batsman and things like that. And I think we need to kind of work our way through this process and figure out where it leads us. I don't know. I hope that was a proper answer.
All right. So I'm going to give you now a few questions that the live viewers have asked. So the first one is by Shiprita, who says, so what was the value of the yojana that was taken? I mean, is it saying is it fixed or not? Like, is it fixed across all Puranas, or it keeps varying from one Purana to the other?
Very, very good question. Very good question. So in the book, I actually mentioned that the Puranas themselves have 4 different values of the yojana, right? So the Puranas themselves. The normal value of the yojana that is used in the Arthashastra is about 12.3 kilometers. I just used so when I gave you the calculation of the Earth, right? I said 1,000. It says 9,000 yojana between Kanyakumari and Gangotri. That is a verse from the Puranas. So if you calculate that, it's about 2.8 yojana to a kilometer. It's actually the other way around. So I'm speaking from memory here. I don't know exactly. It's about 3 yojana to a kilometer. And then there is at other places there is 8 yojana to a kilometer. So it's useful to think of it as the yojana. The word yojana actually means plan, right? And in a plan at the bottom you have a scale, and so it looks like this is like the scale of a plan. So it kind of seems to vary depending on the use. For example, in the Surya Siddhanta, they seem to use a slightly different, and it's kind of quantified there what the different number is. And so the question is very valid. For the computation of the distance of the extent of the Earth, I've used 12.3 kilometers. For the computation of the extent of Jambudvipa, I've just calculated from what the Purana itself says, right? It says 9,000 yojana, and it's 2,600 kilometers, which gives to 3 yojana to a kilometer. So you have quite a range inside the Puranas themselves. Very good question, Devaji.
All right. So also Puranas are kind of localized texts, right? They are about a specific area or a region. So how does one extrapolate that in this larger narrative that you have been weaving?
So there are 3 kinds of Puranas. There is a Mahapurana, there is an Upapurana, and there's a third Purana called a Sthala Purana. The Sthala Purana is for that region. So the Sthala Purana for Kashmir is called the name slips my mind, yeah. So there it has, every region has its own Sthala Purana, right? Not every region, many regions have their own Sthala Purana that still come to us. And so they talk about events in that place, specific to that place. The Mahapuranas talk about the universe, right? And so they have the Panchalakshana, which is the Sarga, Pratisarga, Vamsacharita, and so on and so forth, right? The 5 things, which includes the creation, primary creation, and the dissolution of the universe. So when I talk about the passage in the red giant sun, it is, the chapter is called the dissolution of the universe in the Brahmanda Purana, and the book quotes the chapter and the verse and so on and so forth. So I don't remember it offhand. You can take a look at it. So a Mahapurana has the creation of the universe, has the creation and the dissolution of the universe, and the lineage of kings and histories and so on and so forth. Sthala Purana can be very local. It may not have many of the other things that a Mahapurana has.
All right. So I want to talk about something that you have written in chapter 17. You say this is not meant to be a criticism of the scientific view of the universe. This apparent limitation is inherent within the scientific process. The scientific process is evidence-based. Until about half a century ago, the tools of observation available to science around us to peer as far as the edge of our solar system. As a result, all the hypotheses are built around this set of observations. The scientific constructs are therefore constrained by what could be observed within our solar system. So now the question to you is, how is this a problem?
It's a problem. First off, I really appreciate your reading it in so much detail and asking me this question. That was, it requires a lot of work, and I really appreciate you having taken the time to go through this in this level of detail. So I at the end of this is close to the end of the book, if I'm not mistaken, right? And I offer a view of the universe.
It is from chapter 17.
Yeah, 17, right? So chapter 18 is pretty much the end, and this is chapter 17. So I offer a view of the universe which is slightly different than science. Let me first say this, and I think it might have been obvious to you. But for example, the Purana. So when modern science talks about the comets, like until let's say 25 years ago, we just thought that the water in the oceans just was always there, right? We never thought where it came from, and now it's clear. There is the Japanese mission called the Hayabusa mission that's actually gone to asteroids and collected samples and kind of validated the deuterium signature of that water with that in the earth, and there's a lot of work that's been done. But even today, the feeling is that it's from comets, and the comets are in the solar system, and the solar system emerged from the sun, right? So it's very simple. It's a very closed-end system. The Puranas actually say that the water did not come from the sun, but the Ganga comes from the center of the Milky Way, right? So if you look at the entire story of the Ganga, her home is the Milky Way, is the heart of the Milky Way. Actually, if you read the Brahma Vaivarta Purana, it describes it in great detail. And so you have a 2,000-year-old text talking about the water originating from far in the Milky Way, and you have modern science saying, well, it's all came from the sun. And then you step back and say, how is this possible? You really think science would have a more expansive view of the universe than an ancient text, basically. And it is a hypothesis that I offer that, science has to have evidence. Without evidence, you cannot have science, right? That is the strength of the process of the scientific method. Now, if you look at the past 50 years, we had the telescopes we had, right? It's only recently we've had the telescopes that can look far out into space. We've actually taken a telescope and put it out into space so that it is not blocked by the dust in the atmosphere and so on and so forth. So we've done a lot of work on this. And so we have an enormous amount of data that's coming in now that we did not have 25 years ago. So if our current theories are based on observations 25 years ago, then they, by definition, are based on that mass of data. My guess is that in the next 10, 15 years, as all these various observational platforms start providing enormous amounts of data. For the first time, we've sent a probe to the sun, right? So we are going very close to the sun and getting data. And you also need computational tools to analyze this amount of data, right? So you need computing power, you need a lot of things that you can do to actually be able to access and make sense, see patterns in this data. And as this happens over the next decade or so, I think our view of the universe may change materially. That's my sense. I could be wrong. That's just a hypothesis at this stage.
Yeah, so it's quite very interesting. So just to add that verse from the Brahmanda Purana, it's 151 that you say the learned man should comprehend and retain in belief by means of scripture, inference, perception, and reasoning after testing intelligently and carefully. So
Right.
Here's my point, right? But the claims of the Puranas, have they been tested really?
So how do you test the claim of a Purana? You can say, you don't have to test the claim of a Purana, but you can say that the Purana describes a process that is similar to the process that has been tested scientifically, right? So I go through a scientific process and arrive at what the red giant sun looks like today, right? Or what my view of the red giant sun is. That is an outcome of the scientific process. If what I read in the Puranas matches that very closely, then I can say that it matches model. In that sense, I'm validating it with something that has come out of science, right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. So again, so you talk about in chapter 13, the Puranas suggest three parts, right? The bit where there is a part of bhakti and then there is a part of ritual, etc. Now, here's my point. So there itself inside the Puranas, so we cannot deny that it is a spiritual text when the text itself says there is the bhakti part, there is a ritual part.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So which is where so let me complete. So which is where now I take you back to my original question. To deny that the Puranas are not a text which talks about spirituality would itself be inaccurate, right? Which is again where we go back to the problem.
No. So maybe I didn't. That's why I said I probably need to. When I said the book does not contain spirituality, I said my book does not contain spirituality. Right? The book that I've written is just about the scientific part of the Puranas. That's why in the beginning, if you see my opening slide, if you kind of go back to it, I talk about the Puranas contain religion, philosophy, and science. Right? It contains these three things. So, and it contains it in a lot of detail. Of the science, it contains many sciences. I am looking at one of those sciences, which is the origin of the universe, and I'm trying to comprehend a part of it. So the Puranas are an ocean of knowledge. The book that I have written covers a small part of it and does not cover anything it does not have anything to do with spirituality or with religion. It is just the science of the Puranas and how well it stacks up against what we see today.
Okay, so this one is, as they say, off the left field in baseball terminology, or this is a googly. Somebody has asked, they say, do you believe psychedelics may have played a vital role in the genesis of Hinduism? I would say the Puranas in this case, like the hypothesis that somaras was a psychoactive substance in nature. So how much of a role do you think psychedelics have played in these texts?
I have no idea, and I don't. So this is, like I said, I've tried to stay very close to science. There is no science that tells me anything one way or the other, so there's no need for me to have an opinion on this. Right? I'll go back to the point that you made earlier, Kushal. Right? You said that there are a lot of claims and there's a lot of claims all over the place. So in that environment, it is very, very critical that we stay very close to what we understand and what we can validate. And that is what I've tried to do. So this is how there is a lot in the Puranas. There's a lot that I have no clue about. This is what I can understand, and here's what I can validate, and here's what I'm presenting. And it is fairly compelling, right? It's not just a verse or two. There are whole narratives about the universe that are pretty compelling that I wanted to present. So, and I really don't know. The short answer is I have no idea.
So before I let go of you for the day, because I'm conscious of our time too, so what if in the future, Ganesh, we have some discovery in physics or quantum mechanics or any other field of astronomy that might directly contradict the claims of some of the Puranas? So what would your conclusion about the Puranas and their cosmology be at that point of time?
So I went back to what you said, what I said. I want to take you back to what I said some time ago, right? The Puranas are a static document. You can't rewrite it, right? It's whatever is written, right? Whether you like it, you don't like it, too bad, right? Science is a continuously evolving thing. So I actually write in the book, so I don't know the future, but I know for a fact that if I had tried to do this analysis 200 years ago, it would not talk about the life cycle of the sun. It would not talk about the origin. It would talk about nothing, right? And 200 years ago, we had scientists. We had giants like Newton and so on. We had very intelligent people on the planet, but if they had read the Puranas, it would have sounded like a nice bunch of stories, right? It would have had no correlation with anything that they knew. The smartest people of the time, right? And so now science will keep progressing. It's possible that so let's take something like, dark energy. Now, it's a very widely accepted theory, but nobody's seen it, nobody's kind of inferred it, but nobody can kind of observe it, or though there's a lot of energy being devoted to it. Now, is it in the Puranas? Nothing I can see, right? It's not obviously not there. So do I think it's wrong? I have no idea, right? And so like 10 years ago, string theory was everywhere, and suddenly now people are feeling maybe it's running out of steam. So I don't know what the answer is. As a person of science, you don't rush to judgment on things like this. You want to let things settle down, and you say, hey, there's something that is disconnected that I don't understand. Well, I don't understand, right? Not understanding is the beginning of curiosity, right? You can only be curious and be a man of you can only be a man of science if you're curious. If you can only be curious if you say there is something that's going on here that's not clear to me, that I don't understand, and I need to find out some more. So let's say, okay, I'd stand back and say, I'm not sure what's going on here. Maybe I need to find out some more. I don't think I'd rush to judgment on whether one is right or one is wrong or not. So I hope that kind of helps set this.
All right. So before we wrap things up, Ganesh, could you tell everybody, is there any other project that is up in the, upcoming in the future? What are your next plans after this book?
Actually, I'm not. I never planned to write any book, so I'm not planning to write a second book. I don't know. So I didn't, like I said, I didn't plan on writing this book. If I end up writing a book, it might happen, but definitely not something I planned on. But I think I kind of alluded to this earlier on in our conversation, and I said, I think it's nice to have a framework, right? The book is a first step. So the next step is to see if we can reach out to people in the sciences, people that have more expertise than I have, even in things like astronomy, right? I mean, I'm not a solar scientist or a lunar scientist or something of that sort. Reach out to people in these areas, have expertise in these areas, and work with them and get their validation, right? And of course, they need to have some familiarity with the Puranas to be able to talk about it. But kind of bring this framework to them and say, does this make sense? And so we'll see where it goes. And the other thing is, hopefully, I'm a self-taught. I have an active interest in astronomy and the space sciences. Maybe there are other people in your audience who are interested in the medical sciences or in architectural sciences or philosophies or something, observational astronomy, right? And maybe they can read the Puranas and find out a whole new area of depth that we never imagined a 2,000-year-old text to have. So I'd leave them there, and I think the more people that work on this, the better for all of us. The more we'll understand the richness of these texts. So that's
All
where
right.
that's right. Yeah.
I guess that's fair enough. So I guess it's time to wrap up today's chat. So once again, before we go, Ganesh, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Kushal. Thanks. Most importantly, thanks for the amount of time that you spent with the script. I greatly appreciate it. The level of detail that you've gone to, and your questions are very valid. And I'm glad we had an opportunity to talk about it. Yeah. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
All right, guys, time to wrap up today's discussion. So before I wrap things up, I would like to give you a few pieces of information. If you're listening to this podcast on the audio version, whether it's on SoundCloud, Spotify, it doesn't matter, or you're watching this on YouTube right now, I would request each and every one of you to go to the description. I've left the link of Ganesh's book in the description of the podcast in the both. The audio and the video version itself. Buy his book. When I read this book, I found it very interesting because I used to, I like to find out many snippets so out of it, because what happens is at times when you read the Puranas, right? I mean, I read them a long time ago. I mean, my lens was very different. I read it from the lens of a skeptic. Ganesh read it from a different lens, and it's always interesting to read people and their lens. And there's one more thing, a lot of times people know this is a Cārvāka podcast, so they know where I come from. They literally know. The name says itself. But the point is that I would be damned if I did not let alternative voices come and showcase their point of view on the podcast, because I believe in genuine exchange. I mean, I've had people who believe in Vastu Shastra come on the podcast, while I may be a skeptic on that too. I've had people who think Article 370 should not have been removed, although I think it should be removed. But I still had a chat with them. The aim of this podcast is not create an echo chamber where I basically call people who agree with me all the time. The aim of this podcast, when it was founded, 3.5 years ago by me sitting in my little room, was that I want to have conversations with people where we open our horizons. It cannot be possible that modern science has all the answers. It cannot be possible that religion has all the answers. I don't know which memeplex has all the answers. I'm on the side of modern science. Let me put it very clear. Having said that, it does not mean that I will close my eyes like a lot of neo-atheists who refuse to engage with anything religion has to offer. I just think that's a very bad way to look at it. I believe religion is a really strong meme, and we should take whatever we offer. Like, even I'm a student of philosophy. I have my basic life philosophy is कर्मण्येव अधिकारस्ते मा फलेषु कदाचन, and कर्म कर फल के ऊपर तेरा अधिकार नहीं है. That's the sar of that message. And I nishkam karma is something that I deeply am influenced by. Then the Jain philosophy of Syadvad, Anekantvad, that's my moral ethical code. That's how I live. That's why I'm so open to many things on the side of religions and on the side of skeptics. So my request to you is that it doesn't matter if you're a believer or a disbeliever, skeptic, or whatever you want to call yourself, astik or nastik, ishwarvadi or nirishwarvadi. What you should have is an open mind. When provided with a book, read it, write down questions, ask those questions to the author, and then it doesn't matter at the end of the day whether you agree with each other or not. What matters is that you tried your best to understand the other side. So I'll end today's podcast on that note. Once again, I'll request each and every one of you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave your comments. Once again, buy Ganesh's book, and please support the Cārvāka podcast. You can support it by subscribing on Patreon or becoming a member on the YouTube channel, buying merch or sending direct donations to the UPI ID. I try my best to give you all these conversations. I don't fall for the internet clickbait. So I really appreciate all the support that I get all the time. I'll leave you guys for today. Until next time, namaste. Take care.